Hi everyone, my name is Ali Economo and I will be giving a close reading on Lincoln's remarks on colonization. Lincoln often explained before and during his presidency that his paramount object was to save the Union, not to end slavery. In order to do this, Lincoln knew that he had to garner as much support as possible for whatever his decision was to be on the issue of slavery. As such, Lincoln supported gradual emancipation, which included both compensation for the slave owners and colonization. On August 14, 1862, Lincoln invited a delegation of 5 black men to the White House to discuss the plan of colonization. Although Lincoln mentioned colonization in several of his public addresses prior to this date, this was the first time he intentionally spoke to representatives of the black community about the plan. The first time Lincoln uttered words of support for colonization was on July 6, 1852, in his eulogy for Henry Clay, who he greatly admired. Clay was one of the earliest members of the American Colonization Society, which formed in 1817 and established a colony in Liberia in the early 1820s. In the eulogy, Lincoln made it clear that slavery had been taking its toll on the Union. According to Lincoln, the only way to resolve this would be to free our land from the dangerous presence of slavery and at the same time in restoring a captive people to their long-lost fatherland with bright prospects for the future, and this too so gradually that neither races nor individuals shall have suffered by the change. It will indeed be a glorious consummation. The dangerous presence of slavery is something that Lincoln continued to address in many of his speeches and writings. The impact that Clay made on Lincoln's thinking would be seen through the rest of his political career. The document begins from the point of view of the stenographer present at the meeting at the White House. Although it is unclear if the stenographer was a journalist from the New York Tribune, the text of the speech was reprinted in the paper. As the stenographer stated, the delegation of men were introduced by Reverend James Mitchell, Commissioner of Emigration. Mitchell was appointed the Commissioner of Emigration by Lincoln less than 2 weeks prior to the speech. Reverend Mitchell was born in Ireland and emigrated to the state of Indiana, where he became a colonization agent. In 1853, he traveled to Illinois to promote colonization when he met the future President of the United States. The stenographer also mentioned E. M. Thomas, who was the chairman of the delegation of black men brought to the White House by invitation to hear what the executive had to say. After the group had been introduced and seated, Lincoln informed them that a sum of money had been appropriated by Congress for the purpose of aiding colonization in some country. Here, Lincoln referred to the money that Congress granted him, a sum of $600,000 for the purpose of colonization. On December 3, 1861, in his first annual message to Congress, Lincoln asked for funds to acquire land for such an endeavor. In the message, he said, the plan of colonization may involve the acquiring of territory and also the appropriation of money beyond that to be expended in territorial acquisition. Next, he justified this territorial acquisition by claiming that Thomas Jefferson had settled the question of constitutional power on this issue with the purchase of Louisiana almost 60 years prior. This message to Congress came just 3 months after Lincoln issued the first Confiscation Act, which allowed the Union Army to seize any slaves employed by the Confederate Army and grant them their freedom. He mentioned colonization in his message to Congress as a plan to aid in carrying out the freedom of these former enslaved people, even suggesting that blacks that had already had their freedom be included. Subsequent to this reference to the apportioned money from Congress, the stenographer noted Lincoln's attempt to lay out the basis for which he invited the black delegation to the White House. He asked them there to address the following questions. Why should the people of your race be colonized, and where? Why should they leave this country? Lincoln planned to answer these questions in the remainder of his address. Lincoln first attempts to answer the questions listed above in the following passage. This is also the first time in the document where we see the voice transfer from the stenographer to Lincoln himself. He stated, "You and we are different races. We have between us a broader difference than exists between almost any 2 other races. Whether it is right or wrong I need not discuss, but this physical difference is a great disadvantage to us both, as I think your race suffer very greatly, many of them by living among us, while others suffer from your presence. In a word, we suffer on each side. If this is admitted, it affords a reason at least why we should be separated." Instead of focusing the discussion on blacks suffering as a basis for colonization, Lincoln first turns the attention to race. He pointed to the suffering of both races, which he saw as a reason to be separated. This part of his speech serves as a platform for the next few paragraphs where he elaborates on how each race was impacted by the presence of slavery. Lincoln comes to the conclusion that even if blacks were to have their freedom within the Union, freedom would not include equality. He recognizes that the black race are suffering the greatest wrong inflicted on any people, as he says, but he also thought that racism would persist and that blacks would never be, according to Lincoln, placed on an equality with the white race. Equality is something that Lincoln had previously addressed in his speech on the Dred Scott decision in 1857, where he said, "I think the authors of that notable instrument intended to include all men." The Declaration of Independence, Lincoln argued, intended to include all men, black and white alike. It is possible that observing the state of the country during the Civil War led Lincoln to believe that the equality mentioned in this Dred Scott decision speech was never going to be achievable. He continues to say that the aspiration of men is to enjoy equality with the best when free, but on this broad continent, not a single man of your race is made the equal of a single man of ours. Blacks, of course, wanted their equality, and the only way to achieve that, according to Lincoln, was to, quote, go where you are treated the best, which he had concluded would be outside of the United States. Lincoln then turns to the negative effects that slavery has had on the white race and blames it on the presence of the black race. He blamed the war, as he says, our present condition, on the coexistence of the white and black races. He told the delegation that for your race among us there could not be war, and white men are cutting one another's throats as a result. Although some may be convinced, like Lerone Bennett, that this serves as evidence of Lincoln's racism, I'm not entirely sure that this is the case. He reiterates at the end of the paragraph that without the institution of slavery and the colored race as a basis, the war could not have an existence. Although the start of the speech emphasizes race, this is not too different from the way Lincoln has previously described slavery. In his famous House Divided speech in 1858, Lincoln warned that a house divided against itself cannot stand. The country had been divided because of the issue of slavery for some time, and here Lincoln describes the result of that division. He does place emphasis on race, however, it is doubtful Lincoln looked at this situation and concluded that the black race had intentionally caused a war amongst white men. He knew fully well that blacks had been brought here against their will. As Lincoln outlined earlier in his speech, he turns to the benefits of colonization for blacks, especially for those still living under the bonds of slavery. He recognizes that some may not see that they could better their condition, especially if they already had obtained their freedom, but he argues that this is an extremely selfish view of the case. Lincoln makes the argument that freed people ought to do something to help those who are not so fortunate as themselves, especially since colonization included granting freedom to enslaved people. He thought that if the freed people before him were to be convinced of this plan, and compliments them as being intelligent colored men, then maybe others would also come to support colonization. He then goes on to explain that emigration would certainly be a sacrifice for blacks, especially those who already have their freedom. He cites George Washington and the sacrifices that were made during the American Revolution as examples when such sacrifices were made to ameliorate the condition of those who had been subject to the hard usage of the world. Lincoln argues that although Washington gave up his life as a British subject, he was a happy man because he was engaged in benefiting his race, something for the children of his neighbors, having none of his own. According to Lincoln, these black men and women, like George Washington, should sacrifice themselves for the greater good of their people. Although the American Colonization Society helped to emigrate approximately 13,000 people, many abolitionists stood in firm opposition to the plan. One of their main arguments against colonization was the removal of the black race from their native country. Lincoln, in his address to the black delegation at the White House, mentioned that blacks would rather remain within reach of the country of your nativity. Abolitionists like David Walker and Frederick Douglass argued that not only was America the land of most blacks' birth, but they had earned their right to remain there. In Walker's 1829 appeal, one of the most radical anti-slavery documents of the time, asked, "Do they think to drive us from our country and homes after having enriched it with our blood and tears and keep back millions of our dear brethren sunk in the most barbarous wretchedness to dig up gold and silver for them and their children?" Douglas, in an 1849 piece in the North Star, disputed the idea that Africa was the native land of the black race, stating, "They tell us that we owe something to our native land. This sounds well, but when the fact is brought to view, which should never be forgotten, that a man can only have one native land, and that is the land in which he was born, the bottom falls entirely out of this sentimental argument." Lincoln, as a way to discredit these arguments made by prominent abolitionists, questioned blacks' desire to continue living amongst the white race who had systematically oppressed them for centuries. He then turns the delegation's attention to the logistics of emigration. Instead of sending blacks to the American Colonization Society's settlement in Liberia, Lincoln wanted to establish a new colony in Central America, as it is closer to the United States and therefore easier to get to with the transportation available, steamships. It also, Lincoln states, has great natural resources and advantages and a similar climate with their native land. These natural resources include very rich coal mines, which could afford an opportunity to the inhabitants for immediate employment till they get ready to settle permanently in their homes. Lincoln sees this as a speedy way to get colonists to feel successful and independent in their new home. In the last part of the speech, Lincoln asked the delegation if he could get a number of able-bodied men with their wives and children who are willing to go. Although this meeting did not turn out to be much of a discussion, he asked them to carefully consider whether or not this would be possible. He concludes by asking them to consider how this could impact not only themselves, but for the good of mankind, not confined to the present generation, but as from age to age descends to lay, to millions yet to be, till far its echoes roll away into eternity. The context in which this document takes place is critical to understanding Lincoln's intention. The Second Confiscation Act, issued on July 17, 1862, came just weeks before this meeting at the White House. Building on the First Confiscation Act, Congress declared any slaves held by traitors of the Union who crossed into Union territory were to be forever free. Lincoln also worried about the loyalty of the border states to the Union war effort, appealed to the representatives of the border states by promising that emancipation would happen gradually, slave owners would be compensated, and former slaves would leave the country. Because of these two actions, in addition to countless other moments where Lincoln spoke of his struggle to save the Union, it leaves me to conclude that colonization was a desperate attempt for Lincoln to both appeal to the multitude of demands being made and use emancipation as a tactic to weaken the South. Without slavery, the Southern economy would be destroyed. According to historian Michael Vorenberg, Lincoln seems to have made a political calculation that he could not propose emancipation without proposing colonization, and thus colonization became an effective tool in dealing with the politically charged issue of what would be done with slaves freed during the war. Colonization presented an opportunity, Lincoln thought, to appease loyal slave owners, abolitionists, and black men and women. Although colonization is seen by many historians as a stain on the Lincoln presidency, it is a crucial part of the evolution of Lincoln's thinking on race, slavery, and rights. Up until a month before the final draft of the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln pushed for colonization. In his second annual message to Congress, Lincoln said that he cannot make it better known than it already is that I strongly favor colonization. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued a month later, it was missing any discussion of compensation, gradual emancipation, and colonization. According to Eric Foner, there were several reasons for Lincoln's abandonment, albeit a slow process. He argues that Lincoln was influenced by the service of black soldiers, which the Emancipation Proclamation asked for, able-bodied black men to fight for the Union. He also argues that contact with articulate black spokesmen like Frederick Douglass, Martin Delany, Sojourner Truth, and the disaster at Isla Vache, an attempt to colonize a small island off the coast of Haiti with 450 men, women, and children in April of 1863, influenced his decision to abandon colonization. Foner concludes that Lincoln seriously misjudged the likelihood of the border states adopting emancipation, even when coupled with colonization, and the willingness of most black Americans to leave the country of their birth. Even more profoundly, he overestimated the intractability of Northern racism as an obstacle to ending slavery. It is clear, in reading the last public address of Lincoln's life, that he had evolved. In this speech, Lincoln promoted the elective franchise for black men who are intelligent and those who serve our cause as soldiers.